Hi, I'm Dexter Gelfand, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do and why. Okay, I am a counselor, and I'm here to help people to resolve and get over the things that are disturbing for them and holding them back and making their life difficult internally. So, two of the main tools I use are what's called power processing and what I call stubbornly held protective attitude technique. Now, these are very interrelated. So, the first thing we need to talk about is the conditions of the mind itself. Normally, when a person comes in for a session, it's because they want to resolve something that's disturbing for them, something that stays in their mind, imposes itself on your consciousness, and creates bad feelings and filters things in a negative way and just makes everything harder and uncomfortable. So the main thing I use to address this is something called power processing. What we mean by processing, let's take that up very quickly. What I would say processing is, it's basically this. Things happen in life that leave bad effects, that are disturbing, that are undesirable. And when they have a lot of impact, it's basically because they happen too much, too fast for us to digest them. Just like we digest food, we spiritually or mentally or emotionally digest experience. And when experience remains undigested, it's just like undigested food in your stomach, it makes you not feel good. And undigested experience can stick around for far longer. Sometimes obviously, sometimes less obviously, but it leaves its impressions, very negative impressions. So when we say to process something, that's what we mean, to just spiritually digest it, to break it down, to assimilate and absorb every part of it and have it dissolve into tiny little harmless particles. Just like with food, it can have nutritive value. Well, then experience can have experiential value when it's no longer something that we can't control, stays undigested, and gives us bad feelings. So the way this is approached in a session, at least the way I see it, is when things happen too much, too fast, too negatively, and so they're too overwhelming, they're too difficult, too painful, too shocking to absorb and to digest. Well, we have to do something about that. We have to do something. And so usually what a person resorts to, sort of automatically, is to create some kind of pushback, some kind of force, some kind of attitude with force behind it, with emotion in it, that pushes away that experience, whatever it is, and that whole type of experience. In psychology, they have the word for this. That's a defense mechanism. Okay, in something I used to be very involved in and studied, called Scientology, which I'm sure a lot of my audience is familiar with. Um, the view on this is to call it a service facsimile, and not to go into too complicated an explanation of what that's supposed to mean, but it has to do with a computation, which is a fancy way for saying a conclusion, an idea that a person holds on to, and that is used for protective value to push away negative impressions. So that's where the service part of it comes from. The facsimile part of it comes from is that experience is recorded as sort of a three-dimensional moving picture, or so service facsimile. It's a picture that's used to serve us in some way. Yeah, that's not real simple and direct, and I don't feel it's like the best or necessarily truest way to explain it. I use the term stubbornly held protective attitude, because the important thing about this kind of an idea that pushes away something that is too objectionable, too painful, Uh, it's the protective value of the idea that matters, and that's why it's held on to. Uh, Stubbornly held protective attitude. And this is very important to address in processing and counseling sessions because, as many counselors have experienced many times, sometimes when something's addressed in counseling sessions, it just doesn't give way. Other times it seems to, but then a person's complaining of the same thing again, even after somehow appearing to have some kind of release or relief on the area. Now, one thing I've learned very well, and this is thoroughly proven out, is that when you have that sort of thing happen, we're in a session, there's this expression of great relief, of feeling better about something, and it's all good. And then, not very long afterward, the client is complaining about the same sort of thing again. Now sometimes this is taken various ways to mean various things. What I found that it really means is that it hasn't been fully processed. The material has not been fully processed. It hasn't been examined, experienced, permeated. The person hasn't opened himself up to the emotional impact or otherwise painful impact of such material and experiences. Why not? Because it was so painful in the first place that they've erected this shield, this stubbornly held protective attitude. It has some force to it, and it just gives too much pushback for the person to really fully enter into that area. So they may have processed a bit of it and experienced some relief, but there's still some idea, some thought, some attitude which has not directly been processed, that is walling off, that is protecting, quote unquote, from actually fully experiencing that which seemed to be too painful. Before I go further with that, getting back to the idea of processing. In a session, a processing session, a counseling session, auditing session, whatever you might think of it as, the way I see it, what's taking place is those experiences that happened too fast with too much force. The purpose of the counseling session, it provides a context and a safe environment to slow down that material and that experience and just get as much of it can be experienced per moment and just allow it all to emerge, and the client has all the time they need to walk through whatever that material or experience is, instead of the way they experienced it initially was with too much impact to fully absorb it and to fully experience it. That's what we are doing in the context of a session, providing a safe environment where time slows down to whatever degree it needs to, so that seconds become minutes, minutes can become hours, whatever it takes, and we can experience something at the rate at which we can actually fully experience it. That's essentially the purpose of a session. Very frequently, not always, there can be other reasons, other motivations, but that is a very common one when a person is coming in for a session with some hope or expectation of resolving something that's disturbing them. So let's keep that in mind, first of all, that that's what we're trying to do here. We're providing a space and a time, with as much space and time as the individual needs to fully process that which happened, without giving them enough space and time to fully digest it in the time that it happened. And because of that, the time that it happened kind of hangs up for them, is still affecting them. Okay, so now going back to the problem that arises with the stubbornly held protective attitude. This pushback is something the client himself created so that he doesn't have to directly feel and experience that overwhelming experience, those things that were too painful. It's to kind of push it away. That's what a stubbornly held protective attitude essentially is. There's an idea that is created which says, blow this off completely. There's no value in it. It's wrong. I don't deal with that. I'm not interested in that. I could give a lot of examples of such things. Maybe I should at this point. One I've given before. One session I was giving a client, we were processing sort of what's called positive processing, a positive ability that the person had gained, or more accurately, recognized in themselves and gained access to. And part of the processing that we were doing for this involved stabilizing the gains that he made so that he would maintain them. There's specific processing for that I use. And so part of this includes processing the use of abilities to help people to be helped by others with that same ability, to fully accept and embrace that ability in all the ways it can be helpful to oneself or another. And on processing the concept of having others help him through this ability. This client just could not allow himself to consider that idea, really. And the answers he was giving me were all of the nature of, well, if somebody gains that ability and can use it for themselves, I consider that that's helpful for me. Answers like that. And I saw the avoidance, the pushback to the idea of being helped in this way. So when I observe a stubbornly held protective attitude such as that manifesting, this is the question I ask. I say, is there some thought, idea, or attitude you've got that holds a condition in place and says this can't change, or it must stay as it is, or this ability can't be experienced? And usually within seconds, you get a pretty fast answer, you know. And in this case, the answer was that he learned from his previous, shall we say, employment experience that the idea that help is for weaklings, and everybody should be expected to accomplish whatever is demanded from them to further the cause. Some of you will know what I'm talking about specifically with that. Anyway, this was the idea. So when a person starts to examine the particular stubbornly held protective attitude, this is exactly what's needed. The person recognizes that attitude. So essentially what we want to do through any means of processing is have a person reevaluate, to take a close look and analyze the idea, that stubbornly held protective attitude, which in this case was something like, help is for weaklings. We all got to be very tough, and so help is for weaklings. So when you look at something like that, when you look at a stubbornly held protective attitude, and you've seen it and helped people to process that in as many sessions as I have, as many times, you recognize certain things about it. Interestingly, the stubbornly held protective attitude is actually powered by the emotion of the painful experience they're trying not to have to feel. There's a direct connection between the pain of some past experiences and conditions and the stubbornly held protective attitude. They actually emanate the same emotion. So it's very important in the processing of this to ask, well, what's the emotion of that attitude? The thing to understand, or one other thing to understand about helping a person to process their stubbornly held protective attitude, is that that's what it's powered by. It's powered by painful conditions they've experienced. And soon as you start to unlock it and get the person to examine it, if you think of it as a brick wall, you know, the bricks start to come off. The bricks start to break down. The bricks start to dissolve. And soon as they do even a little bit, what happens is the painful experience, the painful emotion, the conditions that were too much to experience all start to bleed right through the wall. So one does not merely stick to the steps of processing or helping a client to process a stubbornly held protective attitude by just focusing on that stubbornly held protective attitude. As soon as the the painful emotion, the painful conditions start to emerge and bleed through, uh, you immediately need to shift gears a little bit and process those conditions, those feelings and experiences, because that is what powers the stubbornly held protective attitude. And that will reinforce the stubbornly held protective attitude. And so when the attitude is manifesting, you process that protective attitude. When the emotion of the painful experience starts to emerge, and you can see that, you can hear it in the person, you can see it in the way they express themselves and their gestures and so forth. So you then want to ask them for the condition that this attitude is intended to protect them from, and then start to immediately process that painful condition. Now, there may be several rounds of doing this. You'll do that, and very often the next step is going to be you go back to the protective attitude and ask more questions that get them thinking about analyzing and becoming more willing to let go of that stubbornly held protective attitude, to see how illogical it is to hold it in place. There's always a point in doing this where the client will say something like, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. As they start to analyze it, it becomes more of a crazy, useless idea that holds them back, such as help is for weaklings. You know, you go through your life with that attitude about help. Yeah, that can't help. So really handling and resolving a person's painful conditions and the things that they most frequently are in front of me or any counselor to resolve involves primarily understanding the processing of painful, disturbing conditions and the stubbornly held protective attitudes that people always generate to try to protect them from the stubbornly held, from the painful experiences, I'm sorry. And so thereby, those are the two items that we need to jockey back and forth between, not by any set series of steps so much as accordingly with what's manifesting at the moment. You want to stay with the client, be with them, help them experience what they're experiencing, and not try to direct their attention away from what is manifesting for them. It's an opportunity to process what they need to process. We all have what I would call a spiritual compass in Dianetics, which has some pretty good value, even though not everything in the materials has turned out to be true. Nevertheless, they use a term called a file clerk. Okay, a file clerk is considered to be this sort of mechanism that that directs and offers up to exactly what needs to be addressed or what is asked for by question. Now, this is what I call that the spiritual compass, one's own instinct to have their attention go to what it really needs to go to for them to resolve what they need to resolve, the next layer of the material. So in a processing session, the way I do it, you want to be very careful to honor and respect that the person in front of you is their spiritual compass, what they're manifesting, what they're expressing. For instance, strict Scientology, it's just the opposite. The mandate is that the auditor, as the counselor is called, follows through on his session plan, and if the client starts to go off in any direction, to steer them back to your questions. I find that it's much more profitable for the client to stick with what's relevant for the client, because it's their session, it's for them. And they're giving you what's relevant for them. Their spiritual compass is always going to present exactly what needs to be digested next. So it's really pretty easy if you understand that and don't fight that and push against it and give the client the idea that someone needs to control them and that they shouldn't trust what's coming into their mind. I think that's very important. So anyway, with that in mind, what I primarily use to address things that disturb a person is what's called power processing, and something else which is called shock handling. The difference on which to use uh, is accordingly with what's manifesting. There are disturbing or painful conditions, and then there are specific moments of shock, and they manifest differently. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but a moment of shock is something where a person just can't get anywhere near uh, the subject. They can't get anywhere near it. And you can see how that will create stubbornly held protective attitudes. And sometimes when the shock starts to emerge, you can kind of see it by the way the person just feels completely unable to experience even the smallest part of whatever the material is. And you simply ask, is there a moment of shock? And they'll be pretty quick to say yes most of the time if that's what it is. Otherwise, it's simply a condition to be processed with power processing. That's how I handle it. It works very, very well. Anyway, the other part of this, the stubbornly held protective attitudes, I have a specific technique and series of steps that are used for that. And again, as needed, at every opportunity, when the painful material starts to bleed through the wall of the stubbornly held protective attitude, it's an opportunity to help the person experience and digest and thus release themselves from the pain of the condition, from the disturbing emotions of the condition, from the filters it's putting on their way they're experiencing things and so forth. And that's mostly what the client is there for. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the actual technique, the stubbornly held protective attitude technique. Now, once we get the attitude, once it's obvious that the client has such an attitude, they may just express it for you. You want to get the phrase that best describes that particular pushback from the client. And how do you get that? Many times they just mention it when they hit upon painful material. And if you understand what that is, hopefully, if you're the counselor, you'll recognize that. If you're the client, hopefully your counselor will recognize that. You know, somebody says something like, well, help is for weaklings. That's obviously a pushback attitude with a lot of emotional energy behind it. That's a stubbornly held protective attitude. There are millions of such examples. In sessions, we see them all the time. So it might just manifest in the course of touching on some relevant material. And if it manifests and the phrase is given, then you go with that phrase, and that's what you're going to use. Now, otherwise, if you recognize that something like that is evident because the client has expressed something being better and being released, and then they're complaining about it again, which is one example of a stubbornly held protective attitude, or certain other ways that it manifests, well, then you would ask the question, like I said, is there some thought, idea, or feeling you have that holds this condition in place or says that this must not change or some such? And then get from them the phrase that says it best for them. You want the phrase because you're going to refer to that phrase in helping them digest it and spiritually digest it and process that. So again, we're using the example of help is for weaklings in this case. So then, because this stubbornly held protective attitude and the phrase itself is actually composed of the energy, the emotional energy of some painful condition or experience, and you want them to start to digest and dissipate that emotion. So one of the most useful questions to ask to get a person to do that, what I would do once we've identified the phrase, is ask, like, what emotion is that phrase? Or what emotion is in that phrase? What emotion do you generate in that attitude? You could say it various ways, but you want to get them recognizing and starting to digest that emotion. What emotion is contained in that attitude? Or what emotion is that attitude made up of? There's a lot of ways you could ask that. And that's kind of a starting point for processing the stubbornly held protective attitude. I'm not going to go into all the steps on this with this video now, but that's a very important question. And then the most important question of all is, well, I'll put the phrase in the question so you get the idea. It would be, what is help is for weaklings intended to protect you from? What is that idea intended to protect you from? That's really the key thing, because that's what it's for. Now, there have been techniques that ask questions like, how does help is for weaklings help you to dominate or escape domination? Or how does help is for weaklings make you right? How does help is for weaklings make others wrong? And so forth. And there's some value in asking those questions. But you know what? Those questions, there's not always an answer to those questions. They don't always apply. But what always applies, and what is dead on core to the stubbornly held protective attitude is, again, what is this attitude intended to protect you from? Now, when you ask this question, now the actual material that was so inexperienceable that the person created the wall with this attitude to try and push away, well, that actual painful condition or experience is being opened up a little bit. You're getting it to leak through, getting the person to process or experience this a little bit. And this is what it's all about. This is what it's all about, is breaking down that wall so that the person can then access and recognize and experience that which is really troubling them. And when you do these two things, which is to ask the right questions, to allow the person to recognize and analyze and let go of a stubbornly held protective attitude, intertwined with processing, experiencing, resolving, releasing, digesting the painful emotion or condition that it is connected to. You do those two things. The life change and the relief is a very wonderful thing. And it's wonderful because what we're doing then is resolving that which is most relevant for the client, which is that which they're really here to do something about. So you listen for and recognize and respect and follow the client's spiritual compass about what to address and what to allow them to resolve, and ask the related questions, which are only based on getting them to open up to more of what's actually manifesting for them here in the moment. It all works out very well. And I will make more about this technique and information available. And I hope to hear from anybody who's interested in experiencing or learning about this further. Thank you very much, and this is Dex signing off for now.